Wyoming Territory, spring of 1883, the night Charles McAllister heard the noise beneath his floorboards. He thought it was a raccoon. He had just come in from branding cattle and was peeling off his gloves when the thump came again, soft, but steady. Something was moving under the cellar hatch in the kitchen. He grabbed his rifle off the hook and swung the door open slow. A gust of cold air rushed up. What he found wasn't a raccoon. It was a woman. She was crouched in the corner, half hidden behind a crate of canned peaches. Her dress was torn at the hem and her hands were scraped raw. Her wide, terrified eyes met his and she did not scream, just whispered, "Please, do not tell them I am here." Charles blinked, lowering the rifle. "Who are you?" "My name is Temperance Holloway," she said. "I was supposed to be married by now." He stared at her, heart still pounding. "You are hiding in my cellar." "I did not know it was your house. I just needed I was running. I thought it was abandoned." Charles stepped down into the cellar. She flinched but did not move. She was shivering. Her brown hair was tangled and there was a rip across one sleeve that showed a bruised shoulder. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He helped her up the steps. She barely weighed more than a sack of flour. She sat at the kitchen table silent while he heated beans and tore bread from a loaf. He watched her while she ate. She did not speak until her plate was clean. "I was a mail-order bride," she said. "I came out here for a man named Roy Lanton. He sent for me from Illinois. Said he had a ranch and wanted a wife." Charles stiffened. He had heard that name. Lanton owned a saloon outside of town, no ranch, just 2 fists and a reputation for trouble. "He brought me from Cheyenne in a freight wagon. I thought he meant to marry me, but she clenched her jaw. "He tried to sell me to a man in town." Charles set his coffee down hard enough that it sloshed. "Sell you?" Temperance nodded. "I ran. I have been hiding since yesterday. I thought I could get to the railway. Maybe find a way back east. You would not have made it 2 miles past town without someone noticing. Folks talk, especially about strangers." "I know." She looked down at her hands. "They already called me a whore." Charles leaned back in his chair. This territory did not have much room for mercy. If the town got wind of her being here, she would be dragged out and shamed. Maybe worse. Lanton had friends with badges. "You cannot stay hidden forever," he said. "I know that too." He stood, walked to the window. The moonlight lit the edge of his barn. His land stretched 5 miles east, quiet and cold. He lived alone since his brother died in the war and left the ranch to him. No wife, no children, no one to answer to. "You said you came here to be married," he said. She glanced up. "Yes. What if you still were?" She blinked. "What? You need protection, a name. I have both. You marry me and no one can touch you. Lanton cannot claim you. The town cannot shame you." Temperance stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Charles stepped closer, voice low. "Because I know what it is to be alone, and I do not think you deserve what they are trying to do." There was a long silence. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. "You do not even know me." "I know you are brave enough to run. That is more than most." She looked down. "You do not have to fix this." "I am not fixing anything. I am offering something different." She was quiet a long time. Then finally she whispered, "All right." He nodded once. "We ride to the preacher in the morning." They married at sunrise. The preacher was an old man with a bad leg and a good heart. He did not ask questions, just read the words and sign the paper. Temperance wore the same dress from the cellar. Charles gave her his mother's ring. By noon they were man and wife, legally, quietly. She stood on his porch after the preacher left, arms wrapped around herself. "You do not have to be afraid anymore," he said. "I am not afraid," she said. "I just do not know what to be now." He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You are my wife, Temperance." "That is what you are." Her eyes searched his face. "And what are you?" He gave a small smile. "I am yours." The town caught wind of it 2 days later. Mrs. Gentry from the general store saw Temperance walking beside him. And by dusk, the whole street had heard Charles McAllister married the girl Roy Lanton brought in on a freight wagon. Lanton came knocking the next morning. Charles opened the door with his rifle in hand. "She is mine," Lanton snarled. "She was promised to me." "She is my wife," Charles said. "She is not property, and you will not step foot on my land again." Lanton spat on the ground and stormed off, but he would not come back, not with Charles' name on the marriage license. Not with the rifle in Charles' hand. That night, Charles found Temperance in the barn, sitting on a hay bale watching the horses. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I heard him. He is gone." She looked at him. Her eyes were softer now, less guarded. "You really did marry me to protect me." He stepped closer. "I married you because I wanted to." She looked down at her hands. "I was afraid you would change your mind." "I do not change my mind once I give it," he said. "Especially not about something like this." She stood, walked to him slow, and placed her palm flat against his chest. His heart thudded under her hand. "I do not know how to be loved," she whispered. "You do not have to know," he said. "You just have to let me." She leaned her forehead against his. He closed his eyes in the quiet of that barn, with hay dust in the air and the soft sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Something inside both of them settled. They had not planned for any of this, but it felt right. Like the earth finally stilled under their feet, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. By the third week, Temperance had taken to the rhythm of the ranch like she'd been born to it. She rose before the sun, her skirts tucked high as she hauled water or swept the porch, her hands steady even when the wind turned raw. She didn't speak much during the work hours, but Charles had come to read the way her shoulders moved when she was content, the way her brow pinched when her thoughts caught up with her. He didn't press her with questions. Some things had to be let alone until they were ready to be shared. One morning she was mending one of his shirts by the kitchen window when he came in from checking the fence-a-line, his boots caked with red mud. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said, hanging his coat. "We're down to half a sack of flour." Temperance looked up from her sewing. "Do you want me to come along?" He hesitated. "You sure you want to?" She gave a small nod, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "I'm not hiding anymore." He studied her face. There was a steadiness there now, different from the fear he'd seen when she first stepped out of the cellar. He nodded. "We'll take the wagon," he said. "Could use the extra room for supplies." The next morning, the ride into town was quiet but easy. The wind had softened, and the sky held the pale gold of early summer. Temperance sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, watching the hills roll by like she was memorizing them. As they crossed into the edge of town, a few heads turned. One of the older ranchers tipped his hat. A boy loading crates outside the post office stared until his mother cuffed his ear. Temperance straightened her spine without saying a word. At the general store, Charles held the door for her. Mr. Hodge, behind the counter, blinked twice when he saw her but didn't say anything. Charles filled the order list while Temperance wandered the shelves, taking her time over bolts of calico and a small tin of hairpins. When she returned to the counter, Charles added a jar of preserves she hadn't picked. "I saw you looking," he said. She didn't argue. Outside, she climbed into the wagon slowly, as if measuring who was watching. Charles secured the sacks and crates, then handed her a wrapped bundle. She unfolded it to find a new pair of gloves, stitched with fine thread. "I noticed yours were near worn through," he said. Her fingers brushed the soft leather. "You didn't have to, I know." She looked at him, sunlight catching the edge of her cheek. "Thank you." They didn't speak much on the way home, but something had changed. She leaned closer when she laughed. Her hand brushed his when she steadied her lap. He didn't move away. That night she stood in the doorway of their bedroom as he removed his boots. "I want to stay," she said. He sat up straighter. "I thought you already had." "I mean more than just surviving. I want to build something here." "If you'll let me." He crossed the room in 2 strides and stood in front of her, close enough to feel her breath. "I married you because I wanted you here," he said. "Not for a day, not until it was safe, for good." Her eyes filled but didn't spill. She reached for his hand, knotting their fingers together. "I want to learn how to be a wife," she said, "not just in name." His voice was quiet. "Then we'll learn together." She leaned into his chest and he wrapped his arms around her slowly, like settling into something that had always been waiting. In the days that followed, she began planting herbs in the back plot, drawing up plans for a henhouse, and asking questions about the cattle. He answered everyone, patient and precise. Late one evening, after the dishes were dried and the fire banked, she sat beside him on the front steps, her hair down for the first time since their wedding. "There's still parts of me I don't know how to give away," she said. He didn't turn to look at her. "I'll wait," she rested her head on his shoulder. "I think you're the first man who's ever meant that." He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand, held it firm, and watched the last light fade behind the hills. They didn't speak of what had come before. They didn't need to. They were building something new, one day, one small kindness at a time. The first rain came in late May, a slow, steady fall that softened the ridges of the earth and turned the air thick with the scent of pine and sod. Charles had been mending the barn door when the clouds broke. Temperance stood barefoot on the porch, her skirts lifted just enough to keep the hem from the puddles gathering at the steps. "Gonna ruin your stitching," he called, wiping his hands on a rag. "I like the sound," she said, eyes turned toward the gray sky. "Back home we only had thunder in July. This feels different." Charles hung the hammer on its hook. "You miss it." She watched the rain bead and slip down the edge of the roof. "I used to think I would. But I don't know if I belong there anymore." He stepped up beside her. "Belonging has a way of shifting." Temperance didn't answer right away. She reached out, let the rain touch her palm. "Do you think people can change where they come from?" "Maybe not where," he said. "But what they carry with them that can change." She looked at him then. There was a question behind her eyes, but she didn't ask it. Instead, she turned back to the rain and let silence settle between them like a warm quilt. That night, the wind picked up, and the sky cracked open with hard thunder. Charles rose to check the shutters while Temperance lit the lamp and moved through the house barefoot, her steps sure against the wood floor. As he returned to the bedroom, he found her standing by the hearth, holding a small book he hadn't seen before. "You read?" he asked. She nodded. "My mother taught me. This was hers." He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "Scripture? Poems," she said, voice soft. "Nothing grand. Just verses she'd collect on scraps. She kept them in this." She handed it to him. The pages were stitched by hand, the ink faded but careful. He turned a few, stopping at a line written in a tight, slanted hand. "To be named gently is to be kept whole," he read aloud. "Her favorite," Temperance said. She said words could bruise just as deep as fists. Charles looked at her, the firelight catching her cheekbone. "You don't speak like someone who expects gentleness." "I've learned not to." He handed the book back. "I'd like to change that if I can." Temperance pressed the book to her chest. "Then I'll try to let you." The next morning, the world smelled of wet sage and ash. Charles saddled the roan and rode east to check the grazing line, leaving Temperance with a list of errands she'd asked for herself. She wanted to start a garden beside the kitchen and needed to measure the fence before planting. When he returned near sundown, she was kneeling in the soil, her hands dirty, a row of stakes already hammered in along the edge. "Got ahead of me," he said, dismounting. She wiped her brow with her sleeve. "I measured by foot, not as fine as a string line, but it'll hold," he nodded, impressed. "You ever planted anything before?" She stood and dusted off her skirt. "No. But I figure if I can survive a freight wagon across 3 states, I can manage carrots." He laughed then, a deep sound that surprised them both. Temperance smiled, not out of politeness but from somewhere unguarded. "You don't laugh often." "Didn't have much reason to." "Maybe we both need more reasons." They walked back toward the house together, her arm brushing his now and again, neither moving away. Inside, while he washed up, she set 2 tin plates on the table and ladled the stew she'd kept warm on the stove. When they sat, she didn't eat right away, just watched him. "You think we'll always be strangers in some ways?" she asked. He set his spoon down. "I think knowing someone comes slow, like thaw in the high country, but it comes." Temperance nodded. "I want to learn your ways, even the quiet ones." Charles reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. "Then we've started." And that was enough. That night, As the fire dimmed and the wind settled against the eaves, Charles watched her fall asleep beside him, her breathing even and her hands tucked under her chin. He didn't touch her not yet, but he stayed close, listening to the hush of her dreams and thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was what it meant to build a life not from what had been taken, but from what could still be made. The lambing started early that year. Charles had been expecting it closer to June, but one of the ewes went down just after supper, and he'd gone out with a lantern while the sky still held the last blue of dusk. Temperance followed without being asked. She brought a dry rag and a kettle of boiled water, her apron tied tight and her sleeves rolled. Charles glanced at her once but said nothing. He'd learned she didn't offer help as a gesture she meant to be useful. The birth was slow but clean. 2 lambs, both breathing. Temperance held one against her body to keep it warm while Charles guided the other to nurse. "She's good stock," Temperance said, watching the ewe settle down with her young. "She's from my brother's line," Charles said. "Been bred steady since before the war." Temperance didn't speak, but her eyes lingered on the ewe, thoughtful. When they returned to the house, her dress was streaked with straw and blood. She didn't flinch when she scrubbed her hands raw in the basin. Charles watched her from the doorway. "How long were you in service?" he asked. She dried her hands with the edge of a towel. 3 years in a house outside Decatur. The woman was kind, but her husband wasn't. Charles waited. "I learned quick how to clean wounds, birth pups, mend a boot's sole." They had a daughter, Lissa. She used to cry when he shouted. I'd take her outside and tell her stories until it passed. "What kind of stories?" "Ones I made up, ones where no one ever raised their voice." Charles nodded once. Temperance looked at him. "You asked about service, why?" "I saw how you moved with that ewe." "You weren't guessing." She leaned against the washstand. "I've never minded hard work, but it's different when it's your own home." He stepped into the room, slow. "Feels different to me, too." She didn't shift away when he stopped in front of her. The lamplight caught the edge of her jaw, the place where a faint scar curved under her ear. "Do you ever think of your brother?" she asked. "Every day," he said. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading between his. "Tell me about him." Charles hesitated. Then, with a quiet breath, he began. "Thomas was 2 years older. He was always faster. Meaner, too, when we were boys. But he'd take the switch in my place if I couldn't run fast enough. He left for the army before I was old enough to join. Came back with half a leg and none of his laugh." Temperance squeezed his hand. "He died in the spring flood," Charles said. "We buried him under the cottonwood." She didn't let go of his hand. "Thank you for telling me." He looked down at her, her grip steady, her face open. "You break me open sometimes, Temperance." "I don't mean to. I don't mind." She let her head rest lightly against his chest. The house creaked around them, wind teasing at the shutters. Charles held her, not tight, just enough to let her know he was there. Later that week, a man named Harland stopped by with a broken axle. He was a rancher who lived north of the ridge and had known Charles since their fathers traded calves over fence wire. Temperance poured coffee while Charles fetched his tools. "Didn't know you'd married," Harland said, accepting the cup. "It wasn't for show," Temperance replied. Harland grinned. "Wasn't judging, just surprised. Charles always said he'd die married to a fence post." Charles returned in time to hear that. "Guess I found a better post," he said. Temperance raised her brow, but her mouth curved just slightly. After Harland rode out, Charles found her folding linens in the back room. "You didn't have to answer him," he said. "I didn't mind. You handled him better than I did." She smoothed a corner of cloth. "I've learned most men don't know what to do with a woman who speaks plain." Charles leaned against the doorframe. "I do." She didn't look up. "I'm starting to believe you." That night they sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of sage. The sheep were quiet in the lower field, the barn dark and still. Charles lit his pipe and passed her a slice of cold cornbread wrapped in a napkin. "I was thinking," she said, legs tucked under her, "dangerous business. I want to learn to read a ledger." He turned to look at her. "Why?" "Because if we're going to run this place together, I want to see more than the kitchen and the garden. I want to know the books, the debts, the yield." Charles tapped the ash from his pipe. "Then I'll teach you." She nodded. I'm not afraid of numbers. You're not afraid of much. She looked out toward the dark hills. I used to be, but fear's a cold companion. Charles didn't answer. He just sat beside her until the stars came out, until the quiet between them grew full and warm. And when they rose to go in, he touched her back as she passed through the door, not possessive, not guiding. Just a hand to say, I see you, here with me. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She simply turned, met his eyes, and smiled. The summer moved in slow and dry. By June, the creek that edged the far pasture had thinned to a trickle, and the sheep kicked up dust where there used to be grass. Every morning, Charles walked the fence lines with a coil of wire over his shoulder and came back with his shirt damp between the shoulders. Temperance took to hauling water in the mornings before the sun climbed too high, her arms strong from weeks of lifting, her back straight beneath her straw hat. One afternoon, they drove to the far field where the cottonwoods bent low near the grave. Charles hadn't been since the last frost. He stood quietly, hat in hand, while Temperance knelt to pull the weeds that had grown up around the stone. She didn't speak until she was done. You said he liked to fish, she said, brushing dirt from her skirt. He'd sit for hours with a line and a tin of worms. Never caught much. Did he ever talk about why he kept going back? He said it was the waiting, said it taught him how to be still. She looked toward the water's edge. Being still's a kind of work, isn't it? It is. I think I'm learning. They rode back in silence, the wagon wheels creaking beneath the weight of feed sacks. Charles watched her from the corner of his eye. Her face had changed in small ways, less guarded, more sure. She met the world with her chin up now, and when she laughed, it came from the belly, not the throat. That evening she brought out the ledger and a stub of pencil, spreading both across the kitchen table. Charles poured them each a cup of coffee and leaned over her shoulder while she traced figures into the margins. We're short on salt, she said, tapping the page, and the iron hinge on the pig gate needs replacing. I was going to ride in Friday. Then I'll come with you, he nodded once. You want to stop by the post, she hesitated. I wrote my cousin in Ohio just to say I'm safe, not much more than that, good. I didn't think I'd ever want to tell anyone where I'd ended up. You didn't end up, Charles said. You chose. She reached for his hand and held it there across the table, her thumb brushing his knuckle once before letting go. They made the trip that Friday. At the post, the clerk handed her a letter with an unfamiliar return. She tucked it into her satchel without opening it. At the mercantile, she chose a packet of seeds, beets, and turnips and a small spool of blue thread. On the way back, they passed a wagon stalled in the road. Axle snapped. A man and his daughter stood beside it, both sunburned and sweating. Charles pulled over without a word and set to work with his tools. Temperance offered the girl a drink from their canteen and walked with her to the shade. When the axle was patched, the man offered a handful of coins, but Charles shook his head. Better used on your next stop, he said. Back in the wagon, Temperance rested her head against his shoulder. You didn't have to stop, neither did you. I didn't think you noticed. I notice everything you do. That night she read the letter aloud. Her cousin, Clara, had written in a tight, looping hand, thanking her for the note and saying she hoped Temperance had found peace. She included a pressed violet and mentioned she was expecting her second child. Temperance folded the page carefully and placed it between the leaves of her mother's book. I think I'd like to write her again, she said. You should. I want to tell her about you. Charles wiped his hands clean from the evening's work. What would you say? That you're kind when no one's watching, that your hands are strong and your voice is quiet, that you gave me a place to become someone I didn't think I could be. He stepped forward and touched her cheek. And what should I say if someone asks about you? She leaned into his palm. Tell them I'm your wife, that I belong here. He kissed her then, not rushed, not hesitant, a kiss that had waited patiently to be earned. When they parted, she didn't look away. I love you, she said. He rested his forehead against hers. I've loved you a while now. In the weeks that followed, the rains returned. The creek filled and the garden took root in earnest. They built the henhouse together and Temperance painted the door blue. She started reading aloud in the evening's poems, letters, pieces of land notices from the paper, and Charles would listen with his eyes half closed, the sounds of her voice grounding him more than words ever could. Come autumn, they hosted a supper for the neighbors. Harland brought a pie and Mrs. Gentry came with pickled beans. No one asked about how they'd come together. They sat at the long table beneath the trees and ate until the lanterns flickered low. Temperance wore a cotton dress she'd sewn herself, and Charles watched her move among the guests with that same sure stride he'd first seen in the barn. When the last wagon rolled away and the dishes were stacked, they stood beneath the stars. "I used to think I needed to be invisible to survive," she said. "You're not invisible now." "No," she said, "I'm not." She turned to him fully, her eyes catching the last of the lantern light. "And I don't want to be." He wrapped his arms around her, pressing his face into her hair, and for a long while they stood that way, listening to the wind slip through the cottonwoods, the night full and still and their own. Years passed. The ranch grew, as did the garden, as did the rhythm of their days. They built a new room off the kitchen and in time filled it with a cradle. Temperance taught their daughter to tie knots, to knead dough, to read the spines of books by candlelight. Charles showed her how to mend a saddle and where the river bent just right for fishing. And every night, before the lamps were turned down, he would look across the table at the woman who had once hidden beneath his floorboards and see not a memory of rescue, but the truth of a life made whole. They loved each other not for what had been lost, but for what they'd been brave enough to build, and they were never alone again.